Hello, everyone. Please continue enjoying your lunch. And as a reminder, the ice cream machine is working. So make sure that you visit that. We are not McDonald's. It works all the time. So continue enjoying your lunch. My name is Dr. Mark Laughlin, and I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at Georgia Southwestern State University. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our luncheon and for our keynote speaker today. It's also a pleasure to have you participating as part of the Humanities Symposium. This has been a fantastic event year after year. It keeps getting larger. I know that President Johnson spoke on that earlier today, but all of it is made possible because of the people that are in this room right now. And we thank you for being here and participating and having this experience for your students and our and our faculty, and the presentations have just really been fantastic. So how about a nice round of applause for all of you. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Paige Gray. Dr. Gray holds the Bachelor of Arts in English from Indiana University, the Master of Arts in Journalism from Columbia College, Chicago, the Master of Arts in English from the University of Southern Mississippi, and the PhD in English from the University of Southern Mississippi. Dr. Gray currently serves as Professor of Writing and Liberal Arts at Savannah College of Art and Design in Atlanta, where they have taught since 2018. Professor Gray has previously taught at the University of Southern Mississippi, the United States Military Academy at West Point, and at Fort Lewis College. Dr. Gray's upcoming book, Bloom Literature, The Cultivation of Young Black Writers, a Youth Literature and Intergenerational Collaboration in 20th Century Periodicals, is currently under contract with the Ohio State University Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paige Gray.
Hi. I'm really loud, but I will turn on the mic here. That one's on. Oh, okay. I am mic'd. Hello. Hi. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Susan, for having me. What a beautiful campus you have. I feel so honored. And I snuck into one of the last panels, and I was like, oh, these are my people. When I was, seeing the free flow of discourse and exchange of ideas. I'm very excited to share with you. This is the book I've been working on. The book is actually Children of the Black Press, and I've re-theorized part of it, and I've re-theorized it to this understanding of Bloom literature. So you guys are the first people to get to hear this. Yay! So this will be the kind of the theory, my theory that I'm using for my upcoming book, Children of the Black Press. Also, I'm very excited. You all should be excited that your ice cream machine is working. I remember when I was an undergrad, and my first job in high school when I was growing up in Indiana was at TCBY. Kids Ask Your Parents. It was frozen yogurt. But then when I went to college, and you go to the cafeteria, and they had the soft serve, I had to show people how it was done. Like, give me your cone, and so. Anyway, thank you all so much. So, again, I'm from, in English literature at our conferences, we always have papers, but I try to use this as a script to not bore you. But I think I'm pretty engaging. Anyway, so also this slide, the background, again, to go with the Bloom literature, this comes from Ebony Jr., which is I'm going to talk about towards the end of my talk. Ebony Jr. was an offshoot of Ebony magazine in throughout the 70s and into the early 80s that was geared toward, for everyone, but it's geared towards a Black audience of children, and they had these sections where children could submit their poems and drawings, and this comes from one of the young people's drawings, and so Bloom, I like a theme here. All right, to begin, because all research is personal, right? I thought I would just open cool things, wade into things here with some personal anecdotes. From my own childhood, which is what I study now. my fancy clicker here, in case I want to be a little mobile. So when I was a kid, I'm guessing it was 2nd or 3rd grade, I desperately wanted Peter Pan to fly through my bedroom window and take me to Neverland. I don't know if anyone had that same thing. I didn't want to grow up. Again, I know that's a thing for a lot of kids and even adults, right? We don't want to grow up. I wanted to stay a child, and I refused to abandon imagination and play and whimsy for what I discerned to be the doldrums of adulthood. I convinced myself so absolutely in this possibility of Peter Pan showing up at my window that there was a period I only wore fancy pajamas to bed. I did not want to go to Neverland in a grubby old t-shirt, because then I would be stuck in that forever. If I were to relocate from Indiana to Neverland and remain a child for perpetuity, I wanted to have fashionable sleepwear. Also, as a kid, in addition, this is my other anecdote, right? And that's me dressed up for the book parade in 2nd or 3rd grade, and I am Peter Pan, even though I kind of look like Harry Potter. So in addition to waiting for Peter Pan, I also tried many times unsuccessfully to launch my own newspaper. Several of my friends would agree to be reporters, but they would never meet my arbitrary deadlines. So inevitably, I had to become a one-kid journalism enterprise. On standard computer printer paper, I would create a front page using a Sharpie to denote the banner and column spaces and headlines. Again, kids, this is before social media. But also, I would create the artwork, which usually consisted of a giant whale, because the main story was always about saving the whales. The other story, singular, was about saving the rainforests. I don't remember doing any actual reporting, aside from reiterating facts that I learned from my many whale books and my Kids for Saving Earth newspapers that I picked up for free at Target. No one read my newspaper. Just like so many other countless children who have read J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, which the professor in me requires to tell you that it was first published as Peter and Wendy in 1911. Or the kids who watched Mary Martin's sprightly rendition of The Eternal Boy, or maybe repeatedly played a VHS copy of Disney's 1953 problematic animated adaptation. I accepted a story of childhood predicated on a host of assumptions that root childhood in a myth of innocence. I was committed to curiosity and knowledge, the opposite of innocence, paradoxically, right? The idea that young people's writing could be published and read by others is this other thing that also fascinated me. So on the one hand, I wanted to be a kid forever, but on the other hand, I wanted to know everything. Like Harriet the Spy says, I want to know it all. I love Harriet the Spy. I believe then, and as I'm here to argue for you today, there's a space for young people's writing to be included under that roomy umbrella of what I like to broadly call youth literature, which is just a nomenclature. I'll talk about it in a second here. Semantics. Today I want to talk a bit about a specific genre under this big roomy umbrella and that specific genre I want to talk about today is called Bloom literature, which I'll talk about in a minute here. I want to ease my way into the discussion by talking a little bit more about what we're talking about when we talk about children's literature. And again, children's literature can mean a lot of things, not necessarily for children or not necessarily literature. So on the first day of my first official children's literature course in graduate school, my then professor and now friend, Eric Tribunella, explained the very peculiar situation of children's literature and the fact that audience, rather than author, determine the category. Again, it's children read that, right? Rather than if you have women's literature or Native American literature, it's about the people writing it. But we have the opposite with children's literature. We don't really see many child authors in children's literature, Eric said, or he said something like that. He probably said it in a much smarter way. Much more sagacious person than I am. In modern children's publishing, this is true. But children have been writing their own literature for centuries. The Historic Children's Voices Project, created in 2024 by the American Antiquarian Society, provides a window into some of these texts through hundreds of digitized items from its archives. The writings of 19th century children reveal lively imaginations and inquisitive minds, the project's website states, noting that young writers recorded their daily lives, wrote stories and poetry, expressed their beliefs and values, and commented on serious issues of the day. This shouldn't be too surprising. And just for anyone who likes research, and I'm sure, again, you guys are presenting here, I'm sure you do. This is free and available to anyone, and there are just these are all digitized. And you can find, and this is 19th century focus, the newspapers these people started, books, and they're all digitized, and they're amazing. And it's free. So history, literature, anyone, it's there for you. Just go to the AAS website. Also, they have amazing fellowships for students. So that's my improvement with that. But again, this idea of young people writing should not be surprising, especially to many of you who are very curious and imaginative people. And what do we do when we're little? We make up stories, right? I'm sure many of us created our own stories, and a lot of times I remember, some of these stories are more imitated, like we imitate the stories that we read. On my bookshelf at home sits a book that I wrote, illustrated, and put into a homemade binding when I was about 6. It's called The Last Unicorn, and the plot is exactly the same as the animated movie, The Last Unicorn from 1982, which is an adaptation of 1968 Peter S. Beagle novel. I didn't know how to draw horses. Yes, I teach it in art school. I don't know how to draw horses. So while imitation is part of the creative process, this doesn't mean that young people's creative works are wholly derivative or unoriginal. A look through the materials in the Historic Children's Voices indicates as much. These materials may readily be acknowledged by scholars as valuable primary texts for understanding the history of childhood. But why are such texts in the writings from Black youth in the 20th century, included in my forthcoming book, Children of the Black Press, not part of the thing we call children's literature? Or even the more inclusive term, youth literature. Again, I like youth literature because it kind of is like super young kids and young adults is just easier. So why don't we include that when we're talking about things, especially when we're thinking about this in the academy and culture at large? Well, children's literature, it's complicated. What is it exactly? Is it text that children read, or is it those texts specifically written for children by adults? These things don't overlap always. I'm sure we all remember some of the books and materials we read as kids, but maybe we weren't supposed to. Indeed, children's literature means much more than those two words might connote. What we call children's literature and young adult literature, offer Kenneth B. Kidd and Derek Mason, is simultaneously a body of imaginative work, a field of professional engagement, and a civic good. But Kidd and Mason also point to its fluidity and nebulousness. Nebulousness, that's a word I write a lot, but don't say a lot. Writing that it means different things in different contexts and is forever shifting in aims, practices, and boundaries. Then there are the presumptions about and connotations of literature, right? I will tell you all, I go to many an academic conference, and you will have a person, I won't describe them, what do you specialize in? And I say, oh, youth literature or children's literature. I get the look. Oh. Shouldn't you be, and again, this is also assumptions and condescension. Shouldn't you be they assume I'm an elementary education teacher. And nothing wrong with that, but to them it's kind of often a slander, which it should not be, but it often is. Anyway. So what do we have when we have connotations of literature, and what does it mean when it's paired with children? Robin Bernstein gives a succinct summation of the field's internal turmoil, telling us, for almost 4 decades, scholars have debated the implications of one characteristic of children's literature. It is the only major category of literature that is generally written by one group, adults, for another group, children. This power differential between adults and children stirs the debate to which Bernstein refers. It embeds top-down power, that is, adult definition and domination of children in children's literature. And, quote, in this school of thought, children's literature appears to address a readership that it in fact constructs and at times forcibly. But many scholars in children's literature and in the interdisciplinary field of childhood studies challenge this premise, contesting the idea that young readers are, essentially, empty vessels unable to critically dissect, rework, and appropriate for their benefit the text they encounter. And again, when I say children, young people, I mean however you understand young people, right? It's kind of generational, so this is a broad category. One such rejoinder came from Karen Sanchez-Epler in her landmark 2005 book, Dependent States, The Children's Part in 19th Century American Literature. There, she writes of her aspiration to bring children's voices into the discussion of childhood, her ambition to discern a method that will analyze and illuminate the ties between the powerful discourses of childhood and the lives, sometimes competent, sometimes vulnerable, of individual children. Children's literature scholars, alongside those working in childhood studies, are now confronting the politics and implications of dependence, often through examining the art and writing of young people in exciting ways that expand how we define texts, the archive, and children's culture in general. Mara Gubar, Robin Bernstein, and Victoria Ford Smith have been at the forefront of this revolution, advocating for young people's creative efforts to be a part of the larger critical conversation and in that research. Within the broader framework of childhood studies, philosopher John Wall's theory of childism completely upends traditional models of power and age and advocates for a more equitable approach to children and their role in society. But it's critical to underscore that the politics of age, which we're talking about here today, politics of youth, the politics of age and youth cannot be disentangled from matters of race, and childhood in the United States and much of the Western world evolves from the ideal of a middle to upper class white childhood. I should add that since much of Western children's literature scholarship centers on or builds from the period known as the Golden Age, which is approximately 1865 to 1914, the academic discourse around young people's texts and culture has largely been filtered through a white lens until more recent decades. My current project that I want to share with you today extends from my research that began during my dissertation, and that later became my first book, Cub Reporters. Given the earlier childhood memories that I shared with you, you can understand that eventually my graduate research would consider the intersections of children's literature and journalism. After receiving a graduate degree in journalism and working in newspapers for a few years, I returned to school for a PhD in English, and I specifically wanted to study children's literature. Cub Reporters largely considers the depictions of journalism in children's texts during the quote-unquote golden age of both journalism and children's literature at the turn of the last century, and more broadly, the reciprocal conversation between these two forms. Of course, in my research and coursework, I became enthralled with the Brownies book, the monthly periodical established by W.E.B. Du Bois and members of the NAACP, including Jesse Fawcett, who was the editor. And they created this magazine to further engage the curiosity and creativity of Black children. Extending from the annual children's number of The Crisis, the primary publication of the NAACP, the Brownies book reinforces what Catherine Capshaw describes as Du Bois's faith in the ability of young people to lead the race into the future. I began to wonder about the wider influence of the Brownies book on Black American childhood, particularly given the paucity of books for Black children by Black authors at the time. Did the Brownies book help create a larger sense of identity and community for Black children? Did it inspire writers to consider more seriously this large audience of young readers? As research often is, haphazard, I started looking through a database of historical African American newspapers, and I came across the children's section of the Chicago Defender, perhaps the most influential African American newspaper of the 20th century. I did my graduate journalism work in Chicago, so I was well acquainted with the Chicago Defender, so I kind of just, again, my own background influenced me to look there, and that was a lucky part of my life that steered me in that direction. So the Chicago Defender, again, one of the most influential African American newspapers of the 20th century. Its readership extended across the United States. People would mail copies of the defender to their relatives in the South, and it played a huge role in the Great Migration, a time during which millions of Black Americans left their southern homes for job opportunities in northern industrial cities like Chicago. Indeed, it has been said that with the exception of the Bible, no publication was more influential among African Americans during the first half of the 20th century. With newspaper sales of this weekly publication estimated between 160,000 and 2,500,000 in the early 1920s. So, knowing that the run of the Brownies book lasted from January 1920 to December 1921, which did not last that long, financial reasons, I searched through digital issues of the Chicago Defender from the early 1920s. And within those pages, I found the Defender Jr. and Bud Billiken, the imagined persona of the children's editor of this section. Bud Billiken was their child editor. And in reading through the Defender Jr. sections over the years following its 1921 debut, I found a supportive community of Black children from across the country. Young readers could become members of the Bud Billiken Club by mailing in a form with their name, and they could also mail in letters and poetry as a way to correspond with their fellow Billikens, as they were called. And a Billiken was like a popular trinket during that time that people could buy in stores. In his first outing, Bud Billiken tells readers he wants to fill this column with the sayings and doings of we little folks. And so there's the masthead. There's the masthead for the Chicago Defender, and this is the form you could send in. And if this is interesting to you, you can read more about it in my book, my first book. Slight little plug. We gotta be self-promotion people, right? So after I published Cub Reporters, I knew there was more to explore with Black weeklies and other possible youth sections like the Defender Jr. I was soon invited to write a chapter as part of a collection for the centennial anniversary of the Brownies book. And indeed, this led me to discovering other youth sections in Black weeklies. So for this chapter I was invited to write, it gave me this opportunity. It's like, oh, let's see if there were other children's sections at this time that were also inspired by the Brownies book. And yes, readers, there was. So I was primarily interested in the submissions from young people. Obviously, there were newspapers that had children's sections that was an adult editor doing it. I wanted to read the things that were written by young people in these sections, whether it were letters or poetry, what have you. I wanted to see the writing of young people. I came to find even more collaborations between young people and Black periodicals across the 20th century, a mode of collaboration that I contend can help us meaning not just scholars, but people in the world, rethink generational relationships. With Children of the Black Press, I'm more broadly arguing, as many others in the field of children's literature and childhood studies continue to do, that the unstable and unsettled category of youth literature must make room for literature by actual youth. But in making this wider claim through the narrow focus of writings by Black American young people in the 20th and 20th century periodicals, I put forward a case for intergenerational collaboration using a lens of Black feminism. My aim is to not only disrupt aonormativity, which is just the idea that, basically adults rule things, right? This idea that there's kind of a hierarchical relationship between adults and young people. So, I not only want to disrupt anormativity, I also want to further recalibrate theoretical frameworks of children's and young adult literature, youth literature, away from predominantly Eurocentric approaches that reify existing hegemonic models of power. But these pursuits are really one and the same. For at the end of the day, I want to cultivate interrogation of how we, as intellectuals, artists, and citizens, engage with and support the development of our communities alongside the development of our individual selves. We were talking a little bit about in the last panel. Because both of these are essential, right? We need communities and we also want to do good for us, but you gotta have one and the other. That's my rose-colored glasses, idealism. P.S. Pessimism is a tool of oppression, so we always got to have those rose-colored glasses on. In pursuit of that grand vision, my current project contextualizes and close reads a neglected youth literature, and I use that indefinite article deliberately, for in Children of the Black Press, I consider a youth literature brought to life within the pages of Black press publications. A youth literature written by Black American youth. So let's look at some of that. And again, this is debuting. No one's seen this information. So in August 1934, a column in the Cleveland Column-Post, an African-American weekly newspaper, began its short-lived, I think short-lived is actually pronounced short-lived. I don't know if you guys knew that. But then when I say it like that, people think I'm saying it wrong. But anyway, it's short run. What seems to be the first appearance of Our Young Poets column, which was later simplified to Young Poets column, opens with a humble note of gratitude from the column's conductor. They call him the conductor. Harvey Leroy Allen, to the Column Post editor, for permitting this space for his fine paper for the publication of poetry by our younger group. Allen lets readers know that, quote, most of the poems published will be by pupils or children of high school age, unquote, before segueing to the column's inaugural poem, The Gale, by Jane Margaret Garland, a student at Cleveland Central High School. So this is the poem I'll read to you. I have lifted my face to the sky. I have tramped where snow drifted white. I have learned how a blizzard can cry like a wolf in the blackness of night. I have beaten my way through the storm with a song in my heart and a prayer. Must one kneel safe, sheltered and warm, to know that God's presence is there. I have challenged the might of the blast. I have laughed at the minutes of the cold, till I came to a shelter at last, like a lamb coming into the fold. I have heard, as I saw in the pew, of a goodness that shall never fail. But the reason I knew it was true was that God was with me in the gale. This meditation on faith and hardship negates notions of childhood innocence and frivolity. The poet narrator's piety arises from her ability to endure and survive the gale, her metaphoric storm. The poem relies on her experience in the world rather than her lack thereof. Following the poem, Allen notes this is Garland's, quote, first poem published, and then he declares, it is an exceptionally fine poem for a high school pupil. Despite this backhanded compliment, Allen shows a commitment to the idea of the Young Poets column. Given that the newspaper only had 8 pages at the time, dedicating even a few column inches to a recurring feature of youth-authored poetry suggests the column post's sincere interest in fostering the writing talents of the community's youth. This choice from the established Black Weekly briefly secured a prominent space for young people's poetry and enabled a potential readership, or an imagined community, to cite Benedict Anderson, across generations, right? You would imagine it's a newspaper, there's going to be young people reading it, there's going to be adults reading it. Some weeks after the Column Post published The Gale, its Young Poets column printed Some Folks by Margaret Ruth Foote. Foote's poem challenges religious hypocrisy and questions the performative display of piety. Some folks are such funny creatures, born and raised to be just preachers. They'll tell you what to do and when, as though your days were spent in sin. It is often we regret things we do to folk, and yet, what do others have to tell what one must do to get on well? To see some folks shout and pray, you'd think they never sinned a day. But then to some the truth is known, that all things good are seldom shown. Foote's poem could be read through the lens of intergenerational power dynamics, with some folks being adults, right? They'll tell you what to do and when, seemingly questions their authority and moral judgment, when their authenticity comes under scrutiny later in the poem, when the poet narrator describes the spectacle of worship. I'm sure we've all experienced this. The spectacle of worship staged by, quote unquote, some folks. Given that this poem was printed in the Column Post to an audience of readers who likely were, like Foote, school-aged, as well as some who were adults, right? The poem proves a bold proclamation and maybe even an indictment to those adults who came across this poem while reading the weekly newspaper. The notion of an intergenerational space for Black poetry, be it a physical space for communal recitation or a printed space in a periodical, was certainly not novel. This is not a new idea, right? With regard to the prominent 19th century writer and activist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, American and children's literature scholar Karen Chandler maintains that Harper's poetry works as part of a family culture that speaks to various family members, and thus it served as an aesthetic, moral, and economical choice for many Black family libraries. In a working class household, especially a Black household during Harper's lifetime in the 19th century, books were a luxury, however necessary, and needed to accommodate a variety of needs for family members from different generations and educational backgrounds. Reading aloud together for Black Americans of various ages was, for many, a feature of social life, and family-oriented volumes of poems would have fit into group readings and recitations that were not uncommon within the Black working class and middle class families, church programs, and literary societies, Karen Chandler tells us. And while poets like Harper created a shared social space among young and old, Black press publications produced spaces on their pages that also encouraged intergenerational collaboration. Nazera Sadiq Wright, she's a professor at University of Kentucky. She studies the intersections of 19th century Black life and print culture. She writes that the New York City newspaper, The Colored American, carried the children's department, a column that targeted Black children and their parents, and it was printed weekly across an 18-month span from April 4th, 1840 to December 4th, 1841. So Wright sees the children's department section, which printed fictional stories, fairy tales, and maxims, as early evidence of a devoted Black child readership in the early Black press during the antebellum era. I'm in the 20th century, but trying to give you a little history here. So academics like Karen Chandler, Nazera Sadiq Wright, and Bridget Fielder, among others, have argued a discernible literature for Black American children shows itself among the pages of the Black press during the 19th century and continues to do so into the 20th. In my field, at least, we all say, well, African American children's literature didn't happen until 20th century. And in book form, that's true, but there was a long culture of family reading and reading for children in Black periodicals, especially church periodicals. And so, because of the history of race in the United States, the opportunities for publishing literature for Black children by Black authors in book form remain limited until the 20th century, and many would argue it still remains limited today. In the book title for their 2017 collection, Who Writes for Black Children, Catherine Capshaw and Anna Mae Duane force a reconsideration of African American children's literature of the 18th and 19th centuries, as well as a reevaluation of children's literature categorically. In their introduction, the editors acknowledge the precarity of defining children's literature in general, calling it a concept under consideration that is complex and capacious, as well as unstable and fuzzy, given the inherent power dynamics between the adult author and the child reader. The difficulty in defining African American children's literature proves an additional challenge given this country's history of white supremacy that created cultures in which Black adults were often infantilized and Black young people were too often denied their childhoods. Ultimately, Capshaw and Duane say that their collection imagines African American children's literature capaciously, which is the word I like, capacious. Again, that roomy umbrella. So in a call to elicit more investigation of its categorical boundaries, Capshaw and Duane ask readers to continue the work of recovery and analysis. So this invitation is where my research picks up. And I focus on a brief reference that Duane and Capshaw made in their capacious classification of African American children's literature that mentions the literature that young people themselves produced. So I call this literature of the 20th century in Black periodicals Bloom literature. The Column Post Young Poets column that we read earlier together belongs to this literature, a literature that in its very existence evidences a discourse of cooperation and mutuality. With this study, I'm advocating for an expansion of how we understand children's literature, one beyond my semantic preference for youth literature. Like many of my colleagues who study textual cultures of young people, I believe that texts produced by young people, and not just those about or explicitly for young people, that are produced by adults should be included in a category that bears their age designation. In examining a specific youth literature written by young Black people published in 20th century periodicals, or Bloom literature, I'm proposing a renewed commitment to intergenerational collaboration, which draws upon theoretical frameworks built by Black feminist writers such as Patricia Hill Collins and her articulation of community care networks, or other mothers, or women who assist blood mothers by sharing mothering responsibilities and who have been central to the institution of Black motherhood. Extending on Collins' work, the radical 2016 collection Revolutionary Mothering, Love on the Front Lines, edited by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, China Martins, and Maya Williams, both embraces and disrupts conventional definitions of mother. Seeing it as a role and an action available to individuals regardless of gender or age. In order to participate in and demand a society where people help to create each other instead of too often destroying each other, we need to look at the practice of creating, nurturing, affirming, and supporting life that we call mothering, Gumbs boldly declares in her introduction. Revolutionary Mothering, which you should all read, it's great, adapts for the 21st century the ideas of Collins, Audre Lorde, Hortense Spillers, and especially that of poet June Jordan, whose 1977 speech, Children's Literature, The Creative Spirit, made its print debut among in the collection of essays in Revolutionary Mothering. And so that speech with Revolutionary Mothering, along with the writings of Collins, Lorde, Spillers, and Saidiya Hartman, as well as the seminal scholarship from my colleagues who study early African American children's literature, this has really changed the direction of my book. I had a whole draft and I started reading this work and it really changed the whole theoretical lens. Or, again, I like to get cute. It was the sunlight I needed to help grow and develop Bloom literature. Sorry. While the conceptualization of Bloom literature derives from and out of the particular socio-historical oppression, marginalization, and systemic injustice faced by Black Americans, I hope its destabilization of power dynamics can be used as a means to more broadly re-examine how we understand young people's role in culture, especially when it comes to their creative works. And again, young people is a broad category, from very young to high school, college age. June Jordan opens her speech, Children's Literature, The Creative Spirit, with a simple yet powerful statement. Love is a life force, she says, a force that's our essential nature and supports our very existence. And again, I realize I'm talking about love, and that makes some academics real uncomfortable. It's not scholarly. Well, let's change that. Sorry. Love is a life force, she says, a force that's our essential nature and supports our very existence. To explain how she arrives at this conviction, Jordan details an aspect of tiger lilies and their life cycle, and how tiger lilies will bloom, so you guys can see this, how tiger lilies will bloom wild as they grow, exactly on the same day as wild tiger lilies several miles away. There's an orderliness, a perpetual inclination to grow, to become manifest from an invisible beginning, a perpetual impulse to expand, to transform, that seems to me the essence of being, even perhaps the irreducible purpose of being. For Jordan, the creative spirit is love made manifest. Again, I realize that makes scholars uncomfortable to talk about in a piece of scholarly work, but too bad. Enabling the task of survival. What's particularly captivating about Jordan's description of tiger lilies is their perpetual inclination to grow and expand. In stating this as the purpose of being, she suggests that children and adults remain in a constant state of learning, of developing, and making new discoveries. We don't stop when, we leave our parents' home, or I would hope not. Life would be really boring if that were the case. Yet, just as Mara Gubar acknowledges in her own kinship model for childhood studies, Jordan recognizes that even if all beings, young and old, continue to evolve, children do depend on you and me, on the large women and the large men around them, because we, the larger ones, possess a degree of power over the lives of children that we would find inconceivable and unspeakably tyrannical in any other context. And so again, it's acknowledging that, yes, we idealistically want to be equal, a baby does need some support. Like there are certain ways, but also too, just in culture, adults have more power. How do we want to use that power? How do we want to be allies to young people? So even though, like those wild tiger lilies, we all may carry in us the perpetual inclination to grow, we're also part of a culture that grants more authority to adults. Often, as Jordan concedes, this is for good reason, but it also can prove tyrannical, limiting the possibilities of childhood and adulthood. When we limit childhood, we're also limiting adulthood. Because of this, Jordan understands the work of children's literature as an act of respect that has the potential to make love powerful. Again, sorry academics, you're uncomfortable. Not you all, but just in the world. Make love powerful, and with her writing, she wants young readers to know that I believe you can handle it, that there is a way and a means to creatively handle whatever may be the pain or the social predicament of your young life, and that I believe you can and will discover or else invent that way, those means. Bloom literature exists as one of those means, invented by Black youth through the support of older generations and institutions during a time in which African American children's literature, though existent through the oral storytelling tradition and through poetry and church periodicals and other periodicals, it remained inaccessible for many young people in the early 20th century and still today. In her attention to the influence of children's literature, Jordan underscores that much of the sway comes from the vulnerable position of children given the degree of power adults hold over them, and notes the additional vulnerability that children who are Black or female or poor or any other marker of difference from their friends and classmates may feel. For all people, Jordan intimates, feeling valued and seen stands crucial in the ability to participate, to discover, to grow, to create, and for young people specifically, the literature they encounter at an early age establishes this groundwork. In creating a literature for themselves that harness the influence of the Black press during the 20th century, Black youth manifest the later words of Collins and Jordan, respectively, in their seeming attempts to other-mother their peers, so that they can bloom in their own place and time like the tiger lilies, growing beautiful and free. Children of the Black Press includes the work of young people who, using the infrastructure of a dynamic print culture, created texts and textual communities that potentially aided their ability to bloom in their own time and place amid the racial discrimination and violence in the United States. So to invoke Kate Capshaw and Anna Mae Duane, who writes for Black children? Well, in some cases, Black children, Black youth. And in the 20th century, they used an accessible vehicle, the newspaper and other print publications. In examining how periodical texts authored by Black young people function as a youth literature, I trace the consequential role that the Black press played in the story of American racial progress. And when understood through the foundational ideas of Black feminist thought, Bloom literature shows us intergenerational collaboration's necessity across identities if this democracy hopes to survive. For without community, there is no liberation, as Audre Lorde tells us. Bloom literature is a decidedly narrow categorization of writing. I'm confining my project to youth writing printed in publications from Black presses, communities, and institutions, thus having some means of adult facilitation or cooperation. This distinguishes Bloom literature from revelatory work that's already being done in a few key areas, including the study of juvenilia, including amateurdom journalism, which is kind of like young people who like started, like kind of like zines, if you know what zines are, but like an older form of that, where there wasn't necessarily collaboration with other institutions. And also child author books and newspapers that weren't circulated. In doing this, I show how these young writers, enabled by the established conduits of Black America in the 20th century, authored a youth literature that today offers us a space for reflection and renovation, and maybe even reinvention, in terms of meaningful cooperation between generations that upsets traditional hierarchies related to age. Admittedly, in parts of this project, I teeter over a delicate barrier between youth writing of Bloom literature and the journalism of school newspapers. I understand that. But the development of and access to school newspaper opportunities in 20th century America, that proved remarkably different for students who were white and those who were not. even after Brown versus Board of Education. So that's an important marker there. So in some cases, a relatively short-lived youth section of a Black newspaper might have been the only place where Black youth could read writing from other Black young people, when in other cases, such as that as Harlem's Frederick Douglass Jr. High School in the 1930s, students, including a very young James Baldwin, could be part of a school newspaper and receive writing mentorship from teachers like poet County Cullen. So there were some opportunities, and I do talk about that in one of the chapters when I look at the 13-year-old editorship of James Baldwin in the one existing newspaper from his time. Bloom literature looks at the work of power and resistance of Black American young people, addressing the oppressive forces of white supremacy and the ways in which Black communities survive despite them. Patricia Hill Collins locates this survival in the persistence of other mothers and related social networks. In confronting social oppression, Collins says, maintaining community-based childcare and respecting other mothers who assume childcare responsibilities can serve as a critical function in African American communities. Alexis Pauline Gumbs catalyzes this idea, reflecting on the ways Black feminism of the late 20th century appropriated motherhood as a challenge and a refusal to the violence created by national discourses that seemingly criminalize Black maternity. Gumbs poses a question and a challenge, drawing from June Jordan's declaration that we will have to make love powerful. She asks, what would it take for us to take the word mother less as a gendered identity and more as an action, a technology of transformation? Which I love that idea. I see Bloom literature doing this action, working as a technology of transformation for Black young people during the 20th century. Bloom literature as a form of radical mothering and a force for Black futurity displaces presumptions of gender and age and really means the creative spirit or love itself. So I can talk a little bit more, I have a little, but I did want to just give you a sample of what this looks like. I look at Ebony Jr. In one of the last chapters. The early chapters I look at Black weeklies from the 20s and 30s. In one part I look at, there was, where I live in Atlanta, there's Spelman College, I'm sure you guys know Spelman College, and they had a great newspaper that started in 1925. In 1925, just again, give you context on how I need to divide this between ideas of high school journalism, there were no public high schools for Black youth. That did not open until, again, I believe the first one actually opened in 1925, Booker T. Washington High School. And so Spelman, because of that, had a boarding school where young girls could go to high school. And in that college newspaper that is digitized, thanks, again, I love archives and digital archives. And thanks to Radar, which y'all can search, they have digitized the early newspapers of Morehouse and Spelman and Clark, Atlanta University. And I found in the early editions of the Spelman College newspaper, the high school page. And it is amazing. So I talk about that in the context of the work of Black women reporters. And I also look at the youth writings of James Baldwin when he was an editor. And then I also look at Ebony Jr. And just to give you some, samples here, again, we have these great columns. Ebony Jr. had a professional editor and adult staff, but they always invited young people's writing. And so you can look through these and find all kinds of poetry and writing from young people. Lots of poems, and just their drawing, all kinds of things. So we have poetry from Marsha Reed, who is age 11. The sun, like a big yellow honey bun. It's a light, like a light bulb of a bulb of electricity that shines over towns and cities. In this big honey bun, ever goes out. Oh, hey, this is talking about suns and buns and has made me hungry. Let's eat. This is funny. And then again, this is the 70s, and this is, the Black Arts Movement. And so Donna McNeil sent in the poem, I am black, I am proud, I am graceful as a cloud, I am black, I am me, I am happy as can be, I am black, I wear my fro, I wear everywhere I go. And again, there's just all kinds of great examples here, which I talk about. And I want to share one anecdote with you that happened when I was figuring out how to write this chapter. And then I'm happy to entertain questions, because there's all kinds of places we could go in Q&A. When I was writing this, it's like, well, again, this is from the 70s and 80s. And like, these writers are still alive. Like, they're adults now. And so I was looking through and it's like, I want to talk to one of these kids who read Ebony Jr. And so I looked through and I looked for names that would be SEO friendly, right? And I reached out to a couple people because I found them and I found where they were. And I found one woman who was a law professor at Southern University in New Orleans. And I was getting ready to teach a class, and I sent her an email and said, hi, I'm Paige, I'm writing this. And within 2 minutes, I got an email back, and she said, I was just talking to my mom about the poem I submitted to Ebony Jr. How did you know? And so I feature her in the chapter, and she talks about how this changed her life. And she now, she writes poetry at the beginning of all her legal papers that she publishes in law journals, right? But it was a really, I mean, it just shows you the influence of a publication like this. So that's just a little anecdote.
Just a second, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we actually will be over to the poster session, but we are going to finish up here, so you don't have to leave to go to the poster session. We can actually listen to our speaker and wrap this up, and you're fine.
And again, but I do want to leave time for questions, because again, this is just a little overview, and I'm happy to talk about other parts of the research or anything else that you maybe were thinking about, because this is rather interdisciplinary work here. But I'm happy to talk about whatever you want if you have questions or thoughts. I've stunned them into amazement. Hi, yay!
What is the goal of disrupting the hierarchical power dynamics of a parent and child?
Because just like power, I think all relationships, like whatever relationship we're talking about, whether it's you and your significant other or you and like having power, oftentimes, again, like I said, with the parent, like you do want, like parents know things and that, but there's a difference between parents, like, oh, maybe you should, or wanting you to grow and discover who you are versus you have to be a doctor, right? And so this idea of we want power to be equal. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, adults should be, or children should be completely free range, but I don't know, should younger people be able to vote, for example, or just, and again, I'm sure, just like we're seeing in culture today, with younger generations questioning why are all our politicians in their 80s when they don't understand, so that kind of same relationship, just having a more egalitarian community. But still, again, learning that adults can learn from children just as children can learn from adults. But still respecting the idea that, kids, young people have some experience, but in the same, just as, sometimes I have people in my classrooms that are much older than me, right? We can always learn from each other despite our age, though there are inherent things that come with being a younger person. Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions, or
Do you see any tensions in the African American periodical literature where adult editors are seeking any control and young people are kind of? Do you see that kind of engagement back and forth?
Not necessarily that, but I do, and I can't. I'd have to get into the archives of the newspaper itself. But I always do have in the back of my mind that question of how much editorial, especially with the Chicago Defender, and I don't know how much is this, because there's this Bud Billiken editor figure, how much is him and how much is maybe the editor, and again, I don't know, and though there may be, I will say it still helped inspire young people to write him, but again, there's probably some editorial sway from the publication itself. And I will say too, I don't know if anyone here is from Chicago, but even though there's no longer a Bud Billiken section in the Chicago Defender, there is still an annual Bud Billiken parade, and it's a big deal. So that there is a legacy from that section. Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
But how do you think this relates to the way we treat the pieces that children write and publish today? Because it seems to be improving, not great. But I think we have a better attitude towards it today, and I just wonder what you think.
Yeah, and again, I'm not trying to, because again, I think there is the idea of childhood, like we dehumanize children oftentimes too, but we also, it's kind of dehumanizing when we idolize them. Oh, sure, because it's so like, oh, children, and so I'm not trying to say like, oh, anything that a young person writes is great. No, they write a lot of crap. But so do adults. Look at all the crap that are published under adult literature. And so again, I think it's just treating it with the same possibilities, and not just kind of saying, oh, like, again, your parents can love the crap you write or the crap I write, right? But again, kind of just like treating it, one, there always needs to be space for creation and circulation and community, right? That's what but in terms of, there are a lot of young people and they write amazing things, and that should, I'll tell you, reading 13-year-old James Baldwin's writing, I'm like, man, I wish some of my first-year students could write like that in college, right? And so I think oftentimes age is not connected to one's abilities. And that goes in all kinds of different directions.
So apparently we are being, the poster session is ready to get started, whether we are there or not. But we should move over.
Sure.
And I want to encourage everybody, because we are so fortunate to have Dr. Gray here, and she'll be with us over at the poster session.
Yeah, for sure.
Continue to talk with her about her work. I mean, I could sit for another hour, I honestly could. But we will have more time, and I want to encourage you to engage with her individually.
Please.
And go over and see the poster session as well.
Thank you.